The Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has secured a resounding mandate in general elections. After his resounding victory, Prime Minister Abe has said that he would firmly deal with threats from North Korea. The local media has said that Abe's Liberal Democratic Party-led coalition has won 312 seats, and in this way it allows it to retain its two-thirds supermajority. The win will bolster his ambition to revise Japan's post-war pacifist constitution. It also means that his Abenomics growth strategy, centered on the hyper-easy monetary policy, will continue.
今回ですね、私たちは北朝鮮の脅威にいかに対応していくか、いかに国民を守り抜くのか、そして少子高齢化をいかに乗り越えて子どもたちと日本の未来を切り裂いていくのかということについて集中的にお話をさせていただきました。つまり私は我々に対してまだ厳しい視線が注がれているということをですね、改めて認識をしたところでございますが。
The leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, an opposition party, has also reacted to Prime Minister Abe's win. Let's listen to what they say.
私の想像以上に多くの国民の皆さんがこれまでの政治というものの全体に、国民から遠いと、自分たちからかけ離れたところで、何かやっているというそういう意識を強く持たれていたんではないかと。いうことを痛感をいたしています。特に現状民進党がどうされるのかということが、おそらく一種の現在進行形なんだと思いますし、そこから遠離れて作った我々の立場から考えると、少なくともその状況がどうなるのかということが結論出るまでは、そことは対しては見守りたい。
To discuss this further, the elections in Japan, I'm joined by Professor Tina Barrett, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University. She's currently in Tokyo. Welcome to WION, Professor Barrett. My very first question to you is, that this is a victory that was in many ways expected, but there are some unpopular moves in the pipeline. For instance, Prime Minister Abe's Abenomics. Could you tell us what is the most unpopular aspect of this three-pronged strategy?
I think the unpopularity of the strategy relates more to the effects of the strategy. And although Japan is experiencing high levels of employment, wages have remained stagnant in Japan for more than a decade. And it's this wage stagnation which isn't addressed by Abenomics. And we're seeing stock markets soaring, Japanese companies are improving their profitability, but that's not trickling down into the real economy. And that, I think, is what it makes some people reluctant to support Abe's Abenomics strategy.
Professor Barrett, but there is also, Japan has one of the lowest women labor forces in the world, and Abenomics intends to address that by offering incentives to women to come back into the workforce. Now, could you take us through why that is so in the first place? Why are, few Japanese women actually going to work?
I think there are multiple reasons. One is there are good tax incentives for women who'd be returning to work on a part-time basis to actually avoid returning to work, because there are tax incentives for their husbands in terms of tax deductions. There are childcare issues. There are very few places in Japanese public WION, the childcare facilities available for very young children. And that means that oftentimes women who might like to return to work are not able to do so because they have to care for children at home. Also, elderly relatives are often a care burden that falls on the shoulders of women. And also, the Japanese workplace is not necessarily conducive to a positive environment for women workers. And women find that they're oftentimes subject to harassment if they are pregnant or if they're returning to work after pregnancy. The Japanese culture of work in general is not a particularly pleasant environment for many people. While hours are long, people are in the office from very early in the morning until late in the evening, and that makes quality of life, especially family life, very difficult.
So you're saying, Professor Barrett, that if were the government to offer women more incentives to go back to work and also improve the quality of childcare and take care of various issues that you mentioned, that Japanese women would indeed be inclined to go back to work?
I think so. I think for a lot of women, they would like to, use the potential. And women in Japan are very well educated. Many university graduates are women. So there's a great human resource in Japan that's not being utilized. And I think for a lot of women, they would like to be able to demonstrate that they can do more than just be carers for family members.
There's also much talk about Article 9, Professor Barrett. This seems to be, this has been weighing heavily on many Japanese minds for a long time. The fact that Japan has been disallowed by the United States, nonetheless, from having its own army, and it has indeed reread that article as being allowed one for self-defense. But now Prime Minister Abe intends to sharpen, the wording of that article, indeed amend it. To what extent is he likely to receive support from, I know that he does have support from sections of the opposition, but what kind of public support is there for such a drastic move?
Well, we currently don't know exactly what Prime Minister Abe's intentions are regarding the Constitution. How bold is he going to be in terms of the reforms that he may put forward? And it's possible that what he will want to do is to give the self-defense forces in Japan the status of a regular military. And that would be, I think, perhaps less controversial than changing Article 9 to allow Japan to engage in offensive as well as defensive military activity. In terms of public support, the most recent polling I've seen showed that only 37% of the population were in favor of constitutional reform, with 40% against. So in terms of actually getting a pro-reform vote in a referendum, which is necessary to change the constitution, I think it would be very difficult for Prime Minister Abe to achieve that, even with the looming threat of North Korea in the region, which is something that weighs on Japanese voters' minds quite heavily. There isn't a strong appetite for constitutional reform.
But surely that strong appetite is likely to come about, given the realities of the very volatile neighborhood that Japan lives in. I mean, you've had North Korea fire missiles over the northern island of Hokkaido in Japan very recently, and there's repeated talk from Pyongyang threatening, to sink all of Japan into the sea. So with rhetoric like that, and also the Chinese expansionism in the region, would you say that the public perception is likelier to accept a change, perhaps a subtle change, if not a very drastic one, but that the article must change? Is that not likelier to be accepted given the immediate threats?
Well, I think that's certainly what Prime Minister Abe is hoping. But there's a large section of the Japanese public that doesn't think that Japan becoming a more offensive military nation will necessarily improve the security situation in the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, in Tokyo, we've lived with negative rhetoric and hostile rhetoric coming from Pyongyang for a very long time. I think there's been more attention to that issue recently, and there has been a stepping up, but it's part of a much longer-term pattern of behavior from North Korea. And as far as the China threat is concerned, I mean, Japan's navy is already very sizable, as is its Coast Guard. And Japan is in a position to be able to defend its territories in the South China Sea. So I think there's a strong belief in Japan among quite a sizable section of the public that Japan changing its constitution will not actually make this situation any better, and it could actually make it worse and give some countries that are hostile to Japan a pretext for upping their aggression, especially China, I think.
Well, certainly, I'd request Professor Bennett to stay with us a bit, Professor. Shinzo Abe's victory is expected to see him turn his attention to two key issues. One is North Korea, as we were saying, and the other is the slow-growing economy. This has been one of the products of a steadily aging society. There seems very little doubt that voter insecurity about North Korea's saber-rattling and missile testing has led them to repose their trust in Abe. The Prime Minister has kept a tough line on the North, vowing that he will not be intimidated by Pyongyang and that he will, in concert with the United States, step up pressure on North Korea. Exactly what he intends to do or has in mind isn't clear yet, but there could be some clarity when President Trump arrives in Tokyo early next month. For now, the focus could turn to Prime Minister Abe's plans to amend the Constitution, which, after its defeat in World War II, required Japan to renounce war. Japan's defensive military since then. It has built up an impressive armed forces, but for constitutional reasons it's called a self-defense force rather than an offensive force. Last year's defense budget was $46 billion. That figure is expected to rise given the North Korean threat, but also because of China's rising military profile around Japan's periphery. The constitutional amendment will allow the military to be sent overseas to work closely with its United States allies and with other allies in defense of national and regional interests. But this will take time and will also involve a referendum. Now, there's speculation that Prime Minister Abe's victory could see Japan embrace the nuclear option, meaning that it will develop or acquire nuclear weapons to counter North Korea and China. What's important to note here is that Abe is a nationalist who sees China as a threat. Countering China, he will move to offset China's growing strength in Asia, Africa and elsewhere. And Prime Minister Abe is also expected to work closely with the United States to counter China in the East and South China Seas. The Prime Minister may also offer alternatives to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and he will certainly not compromise on Japan's hold over the Shinkaku Islands, which China claims too. But the Prime Minister will also cooperate with China, of course. Both countries currently do around $400 billion in bilateral trade, and a growing China means opportunities for Japan as well. And as U.S. trade policy has become more protectionist. Now, they are expected to push for greater integration in Asia, perhaps a mega Asian free trade zone. So it would be reasonable to expect an Abe-Xi Jinping summit before long. Professor Tina Barrett is still with me. She's a professor of political science from the University of Sofia, currently in Tokyo. Professor Barrett, we were talking about Abenomics. Now, there is another aspect which is, I think you know Japanese society much better than I do, but you will agree that it has not always been very open to, they're friendly people, but it's a conservative society. It's not very open to an assimilation of foreigners within Japanese society. That is one of the aspects of Abenomics. How is that likely to be received? Fast-tracking visas, allowing more foreigners to come into Japan and settle there, including, specifically in our case, Indian IT engineers.
Mm-hmm. I think Japan is a country where there's quite a lot of reticence about immigration and immigration issues. And people are concerned about the impact it's going to have on society, how well people will integrate into communities. But I think there is also recognition, especially among the younger generation, that there are certain skills shortages in Japan, and that one of the best ways to overcome those is with skilled immigration from overseas. So I think it's partly a generational issue. And as we see younger people becoming sort of the mainstream of Japanese society, becoming the policymakers, I think we can expect perhaps more of a favorable environment for immigration. It's also something that's quite regional. In central Tokyo, for example, I think immigration is perhaps more accepted than it is in other parts of the country. But I've been living in Japan for 10 years, and there are still occasions when it's quite clear that people are uncomfortable with a non-Japanese person as a neighbor or as a person who's using their business, for example.
Right.
But that happens everywhere.
Right, certainly, it certainly does. Thank you very much, Professor Tina Barrett, for joining us from Tokyo, and we hope to have you back on our show one of these days. Moving on, an Abe victory will also signal continuity in the India-Japan relationship. The Japanese Prime Minister and his Indian counterpart have invested considerable political capital in each other. Now, if you recall, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and his wife were being taken around in an open vehicle through the streets of Ahmedabad last month. That was just before he formally inaugurated, along with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the high-speed train project.
एक अच्छा दोस्त हमेशा समय और सीमा के बंधनों से परे होता है, और आज जापान ने दिखा दिया है कि वो भारत का कैसा मजबूत दोस्त है, जो सीमा और समय से परे है। मुंबई अहमदाबाद के बीच भारत का पहला दोनों देशों के बीच मजबूत होते संबंधों का भी एक उम्दा उदाहरण है, एक प्रतीक है।
ठीक 10 वर्ष पहले मुझे भारत की संसद में भाषण देने का शुभ अवसर मिला था। जापान और भारत के संबंध दुनिया के किसी भी द्विपक्षीय संबंध से अधिक संभावनाओं से भरपूर हैं। ताकतवर भारत जापान के हित में है और ताकतवर जापान भारत के हित में है।
Right, I can't wait to board that train. Now, do recall also the ambitious plan to train over 1 lakh Indians in a range of specializations ahead of Japan hosting the 2020 Olympics. Japan is experiencing a serious shortage of construction workers, and the expectation is that the Indians, after training, will fill a huge labor gap. Once the games are over, Japanese companies are expected to bring these trained workers to India for the high-speed train project, besides others. India-Japan trade and investment. The current trade figures are unimpressive, not more than $15 billion, and India's exports to Japan are less than $4 billion, while imports are nearly $10 billion. Prime Minister Abe has pledged $35 billion in direct investment in India. This year's figures are a little over $4 billion. In politically strategic terms, or in terms of political strategy rather, India sees Japan in the ranks of middle powers with a sound economy, high levels of technology and expertise, and a growing military profile. Japan has not only stood up to China's claims on its territory. Under Prime Minister Abe, it is expected to challenge China's spurious claims to the South China Sea. Now, if you recall, Japan was the only country to publicly back India during the Doklam standoff not long ago. And although the two countries are yet to firm up any agreements involving military hardware, Japan is keen to supply India the US-2 amphibious aircraft. Japan is also keen to sell the Soryu-class submarine, but in the absence of any Make in India component, that has not moved forward yet. Nevertheless, as political confidence in each other grows, Japan may find it easier to open the doors to military cooperation as well. Japan recently joined the Malabar series of naval exercises, which also involves the United States. The likely entry of Australia in the near future could see the emergence of a quadrilateral defense arrangement. Japan's nuclear expertise. The two countries operationalized, their civil nuclear cooperation agreement in July. This is Japan's first deal with a country which is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Japan is a key player in the nuclear energy market worldwide. It also possesses critical technologies, including steel shields for the nuclear reactor core.